The miscarried animal and the self-birth of the subject. Quoting Jean-Paul's selections from the Papers to the Devil, man is the great in the book of nature. Readers note that pause, I think, is like a blank or something. Man is the great blank in the book of nature or something? I don't know, I haven't read Jean-Paul. Okay. If we follow the footsteps of the uncanny all the way back to the origin, we encounter the human drama of birth. The way that humans come into the world presumably contains the complete key to the code of the problem of nothingness. If the word nothing is supposedly more than a pretext for charlatanism, then it is the indication that for humans it does not suffice to be born in order to arrive in the world. The physical birth of a human is the opposite of our coming into the world. It is the dropping out from all that is familiar, a plunge into the uncanny, finding yourself exposed in a frightening location. This is true in three ways. First, for the human child, being born means bidding farewell to its intrauterine life, which is probably the only stage of its reception in the world that has a truly hidden, homey character, provided that the foothills of the predatory outside world do not encroach on it. In any case, the birth exodus into the world is an adventure ride through uncanny forests that render the spookiness of Atreu's forest rather bourgeois by comparison. Second, coming into the world means arriving in uncertainty, because for humans more than any other beings, the world is something that does not get defined from the outset, that is not a foregone conclusion, but something that has to be determined and established. The place of arrival itself is made uncertain and set in motion by the arrival of the human, that constructive animal. Anyone who had the bad idea to fall out of the womb straight into Tokyo, Mexico City, New York, or Cairo will soon have to sing a song about the uncanny life in the thicket of cities. And third, for humans, giving birth always means getting there way too early, and finding oneself in a state that is absolutely unsuitable for a successful arrival in reality, a state of total disorientation, helplessness, and embarrassment. The only thing that helps us in this exposed situation is the fact that in the beginning, the world to which we come is identical, with one small exception, to the mother from which we come. This small exception is precisely the measure of ontological difference, because as soon as we are old enough to get to know our mother from the outside, we begin to get to know a world that is not our mother. It may be said that the strange difference between mother and non-mother preoccupies humans for the rest of their lives, because they can never quite understand how the world that at first felt like the mother could transform into the world that looks the way we know it to look now. We will not say how, to avoid summoning panic into the room. If we want to start from a reflected concept of the world, we can no longer seriously claim that humans come into the world via their birth. A nameless something is put in a position of which it cannot promise itself anything certain or good unless it had arrived to a mother, and people who promise it a certain and good world. This has a far-reaching consequence for the philosophical concept of the world in which the human newcomer arrives, by its very nature, nothing more than a promise that the older inhabitants of the world make to the newcomers. A promise predestined to be broken owing to the liability of worldly conditions. With this, the question of nothingness takes on a new form. Nothingness can now either mean that nothing is promised to those who come into the world, so that they cannot promise themselves much from their own human existence either, and consequently develop an inclination to return from the whence they came into the womb, to death, into the monist all-nothingness, a motif that has its place in all redemptive religious and all doctrines of all-in-one unity. Or it suggests that nothing will come of the great promises that were made, and that none of the expectations of the world that have been roused in us by mothers will be fulfilled in a world as non-mother. A motif that all versions of worldly-wise skepticisms, cynicisms, and nihilisms deal with. The uncanniness of the human coming into the world, therefore, has its grounds in the unreliability of human promises. Does this stem from individual recklessness, from irresponsibility, from the moods of the unpredictable bipeds? No, it stems from the fact that the world given as a promise has something untenable in itself, or, if tenable, then only with luck and effort. In the uncanny, the unstoppable tendency of promises appeals to us to the point of untenability. That is why our coming into the world has a pull into nothingness from the outset. Even though every birth is also inherently a promise to the world, in every promising birth a succumbing to the untenable is also at play, because the promised world is marked by untenability. It even has to be said that a hint of miscarriage adheres to every birth. Humans do not arrive as solid objects into robust worlds. Rather, the world emerges for them through the fact that they are born slightly to the side and exposed to the ungiven, the uncanny. Nietzsche only half formulated this relationship when he spoke of nihilism as the uncanny visitor who haunts modern existence. It is not that an otherwise saddle-proof life receives terrible visits and rare crises. It is already a visit into the uncanny of its own accord. We always run off course. We always drift a little bit further away in the great chain of being. Humans are an open link. As a living being, the human is therefore a pure problem, a chronic miscarriage. From the outside, there is a gap between each newly born individual and previous life up to that point. This gap opens up each time insofar as the forced displacement through the newly born endure at their arrival reaches into the uncanny. This gap is the space where we experience nothingness as something that can be present and into which we have been placed. The world is built into this gap. Earth can rise and arrive in it. The ropes of promises stretch across it as people venture out onto them like tightrope walkers. In the shadow of these considerations, it becomes apparent that the human is not simply a living being endowed with reason, but a being who must lead their life. Without a way of life, human life is nothing in the doable sense, neither life nor human. But people have to promise their lives to themselves before they can lead them. As for us, the decisive thing is done under the guidance of life-giving promises, and thus we depend on them from our first to our last day. Without the inflow of affirmations that promise and validate our lives, we cannot keep ourselves alive psychologically or biologically. According to paleoanthropological findings, people who are cut off from all promises die a psychogenic death within 48 hours. The human standard of living is always disputed by promises. If human beings are not living beings, but life-leading beings, then the source of a specifically human fragility is here laid bare. The leading of their lives depends on the keeping of promises that tend towards the untenable of their own accord. When mothers take their crying children into their arms and assure them that everything will be okay, they promise them more than can be kept. But they also cannot not promise it to them, as if they do not wish to learn to let their children sink prematurely into untenability. Each individual learns early enough that the hard shadows of untenable promises falls upon human life, and that existence entails not only standards of living and leading a life on the basis of kept promises, but also substandard living and the misleading of life because of promises not kept. These circumstances help explain why life comes to account for its primary uncanniness only involuntarily and under the utmost duress. It is, after all, the usual point of accounting to present life as something predictable, meaningful, familiar, and reliable. The primordial promise of life, philosophically called reason, is to object to the failure to keep promises, and to insist that reason delivers what it promises. Was reason not at one time also an expression for the influx of auspicious reasons to live for our already ever-endangered existence? That is why reason has the structure of a self-sustaining promise for us, and the invasion of the unreasonable is generally perceived as scandalous and devastating, because when the promise of reason is broken, it may seem that there is ultimately nothing to the promises of the world and of life. These considerations make it clear why an anthropology that has not worked its way through a theory of birth must remain insipid. Only philosophy of birth can become so attentive to the abyssal side of human coming into the world that it fuses the term world together with the drama of arriving in it. From a birth philosophical point of view, the human is the being who had the power not to be an animal and to venture out into a world that is only given by promise. In this respect, anthropology is nothing more than the science of recklessness, of human beings' frivolity in establishing ways of life upon promises. Who could deny that the book of history contains a great variety of impostures generated by promises? And who can escape the impression that the people of the highly cultural, that is, promising era, have promised themselves something that will probably not be possible to be kept in the long run? That the psychologico-cultural and technical apparatuses that were built to keep the wrong promises are themselves approaching collapse by now in order to keep up with the untenability of what was promised. Anthropology as a science of recklessness becomes the central discipline of philosophy as soon as it elaborates a general concept of the subject as a holder of untenable positions. What the subject and what subjectivity is can therefore no longer be adequately grasped with conventional philosophical formulas. It is neither a substrate, in the sense of the Greek hypokaimenon, nor a pure acting or bringing forth in the sense of the modern philosophies of activity, but an ensemble of behaviours that can be grouped around the basic gestures of carrying, making, and keeping. If the world already has the form of a promise for humans in its given condition, then the human being is, insofar as it is in the world and has come to it, as the subject and receiver of the promise, also already its carrier and keeper. Even the famous self-preservation, which has been philosophically often determined as the foundational aspiration of subjectivity, is in turn a descendant of that holding by which the world is kept and carried on as a promise through subjective efforts. The fact that modern philosophy has placed its principle in active subjectivity, of course, already suggests that it has found the courage to embark on a history-making adventure in order to promise itself the utmost from its own actions in the world. What else is the philosophy of subjectivity other than a logical machine that believes it has identified the keeper of all possible promises in the free-thinking and acting subject? As free-thinking and acting, the human is regarded from the ground up as the self-preserving, auspicious being. As subject, the human is the guarantor of the promises with which the miscarried animal gives itself its world. Only where the subject renders its stabilizing contribution does the world get held up as given for human beings. By means of this contribution alone, the arrival of newborns does not immediately lead to a fall into bottomlessness. The subject, as self-keeper of the promises given to it, delays its fall at a tolerable stage. This delay, or holding up, is the effort that I am. Subjectivity as an act of self-preservation is therefore not a calm substrate, but a self-exertion. It is no coincidence that the philosophies of subjectivity at their highest level lead to theories of work. After all, the term, work, even after its deceptive career at the firm of Hegel and Marx, still preserves a memory of the archaic efforts to keep the promises of the world. And if we know today that the equation of subject and worker is based on a productivist short circuit, there are still good reasons to point out their relationship of origin in terms of subjectivity and exertion. Funnily enough, the philosophies of the subject have made a lot of fuss about the subject's spontaneity. People wanted to sniff out the tracks of freedom within it. In truth, the philosophy of the subject is not so much interested in freedom as in the priming of possible outlets for the effort that I am. What is called spontaneity is basically the self-imposed exertion towards effort, which drifts and ferments in the subject as kinetic energy. It is hardly surprising that the freedom-impassioned philosophies of the subject could not uncover the reason for exertion in the subject itself. In all the talk of activity, spontaneity, obligation, and desire, together with the source metaphorical indulgence in the quote-unquote arising from within oneself, it was misunderstood that the basic exertion or effort that flows into spontaneity stems from a trace of miscarriage on the human. The human becomes subject only because of, and to the extent that it does not come into the world only by leaving its mother's womb, but has to offer up enormous additional efforts to establish and maintain the world into which it comes. Although subjectivity is, as idealism has taught us, only understandable from the omen of pure activity, this in turn is not a quote-unquote deed, neither a Fichtean self-positing, nor Sartre's self-choosing, but rather one with the already exerted effort in contrast to the pre-subjective abandonment into the uncanny, to bring oneself by means of self-birth into the world and gain status in it through one's own self-stance. The subject is everything that tries to become and be its own world for itself. How? By sticking to itself, its principles, and its concern for itself. This self-stance has several faces. It appears as abstinence, as a holding oneself to chosen norms, as self-reliance, as self-preservation, as self-justification. Therefore, it is not surprising that the history of the subject has been a history of stances since the very beginning. From the Stoics to existentialism, from the glowing desert saints to the cool young city dwellers, the subject always steps in front of us as a self-composed centre of effort, as the active principle of an exerted stance against the sluggish, shapeless and depressing outside world. Whether the subject holds itself up as an ascetic self by abstaining from all seductive, disruptive and frightening influences, whether it stands up to the hopeless and untenable world by holding on to the belief in God or godliness, whether it constitutes itself as an autonomous self, sustained by a philosophizing reason, which is in turn appointed as the self-guardian of its laws, whether it tries to maintain itself as a conqueror of life fatigue in order to make itself heroically and self-extravagantly a gift to the world, whether it knows itself, gloomily resigned to self-acceptance, to be held out into nothingness, whether it rides the waves on the surfboard of its desire in anti-Oedipal exhilaration, whether it angrily sticks to the style of its terribly splintered way of riding before sovereignty, and watches from the corners of its eyes as it eludes itself. The subject is always there to give itself a firm foothold and a stance through effort that resemble a self-birth. Through its inevitably monstrous position, the subject is spontaneously, quote-unquote spontaneously, condemned to the effort to stabilize its hold by means of its own promises in a world taken over on revocation. According to their purpose, stances are always expectations of the world's continued existence and of the keeping of its promises, not least into expectations of the repeatability of once acquired programs. Even those who are committed to the Stoic doctrine of nil admirari and no longer promise themselves anything from the world, at least expect that the world will no longer agitate them out of their stance through some kind of a surprise. Then the house of cards of external conditions may by all means collapse, as long as one's stance musters the power to persevere, as long as the subject's status remains unaffected by the upheavals of external holdings. As self-holder and self-carrier, the subject cannot help but become set on tendentially worldless, or at least counter-worldly attitudes. After all, it lives, as we have seen, only on the effort to bring oneself forth and outward through a self-birth, like the keeping of its own promises or those it has appropriated. Thus, the self-sustaining activity of the subject is inseparable from a certain counter-worldly self-breeding. Foucault would say self-care, which serves a heightened coming into the world. Nietzsche is more responsible for this than other newer thinkers. It was he who, in his Genealogy of Morality, elevated the subject's autogenesis to a philosophical agenda. Quote, "To breed an animal with the prerogative to promise. Is that not precisely the paradoxical task which nature has set herself with regard to humankind? Is it not the real problem of humankind? That is precisely what constitutes the long history of the origins of responsibility. That particular task of breeding an animal with the prerogative to promise includes the task of making man predictable. Let us place ourselves at the end of this immense process, where we then find the sovereign individual, a man with his own independent enduring will, whose prerogative it is to promise, the possessor of an enduring unbreakable will." End quote. How does nature come to take on such a demanding task with regard to humans? How does it lapse into the idea of creating beings who have to plunge into the adventure of self-generation so that they can live? Nietzsche leaves these questions unanswered, but his way of speaking of nature's self-posed task invites us to think of an ambitious mother who celebrates herself and her children. In Nietzsche's rhetoric of increase and breeding, the self-generating process of an increased life in the wake of highest promises comes very clearly to prominence. The clear text version of this idea can be found, one would like to say, of course, in Karl Marx, who in Nietzsche's year of birth in 1844 identified man as a born self-generator. Quote, "Because socialist man understands the whole of what is called world history as nothing but man's creation through human labour, he has the observable, irrefutable proof of his birth through himself." End quote. Of the triumphs and torments of self-generating effort, however, it is only Nietzsche, not Marx, who can convey a term, because he, unlike the thinker of socialism, knows that in the self-birthing of the self, it is not work that is at stake, but burdens of pregnancy, birth pains, suffering, labours in the English language, the struggle for existence, ponos in the Greek language, the inevitable self-generating expropriations of life to which no reappropriation corresponds, and at best the euphoria of taking a deep breath outside. Quote, "What do I find absolutely intolerable? Something which I just cannot cope alone with, and which suffocates me and makes me feel faint. That something failed comes near me. Apart from that, what cannot be borne in the way of need, deprivation, bad weather, disease, toil, solitude? Well, basically we can cope with everything else, born as we are to an underground and battling existence. Again and again we keep coming up to the light. Again and again we experience our golden hour of victory. And then there we stand, the way we were born, unbreakable, tense, ready for new, more difficult and distant things." End quote. The subject's self-birth, Nietzsche's formulas say, is a birth into standing. Marx also provides the consonant second voice. Quote, "A being only stands itself as independent when it stands on its own 2 feet, and it stands on its own 2 feet as long as it owes its existence to itself." End quote. Thus, this type of birth leads directly into the vertical, that is, to standing thanks to one's own erection, without sidelong glances for possibilities of tolerably lying down or fundamentally being carried. Because it is about immediate self-establishment, the self-born and increasing subject for Nietzsche is also not the same as the passively born, misguided subjects who, because they themselves are reduced, poisoned, suffocated, can't help but spread an atmosphere of asphyxiation and reduction around them, much to the agony of those who still carry the sting of success in their flesh. That is why the determined self-birthers must repel the obscenely comfortable, mediocre, and atrophied. Quote, "But who would not, 100 times over, prefer to fear if he can admire at the same time, rather than not fear, but thereby permanently retain the disgusting spectacle of the failed, the stunted, the wasted away and the poisoned." End quote. The willingness to face what is frightening is given to the self-birther as a sign of election, that is, as a spur of self-intensification. The intensity of the subject is synonymous with the urge on its being pregnant with itself. What the subject can bring forth from itself through the force of its exertion is always only itself, and the world into which it will come can never be anything other than its own, self-designed, self-generated. By energetically bringing itself into its own world, the subject opens up an unbridgeable distance to the world of others. From this distance, maintained by the self-care of the self-producing subject, the abstinent stances arise for which the Greeks coined the word askesis, and the moderns the term individuality. If the self-emphasizing subject displays a brittle stance towards foreign worldly seductions, talk, fame, topicality, women, princes, careers, is it not from morbid or self-torturous inclinations, as befits a corrupt notion of asceticism, but out of the clear instinct of wanting to serve only a single effort? Quote, "His motherly instinct, that secret love towards what is growing inside him, shows him places where he can be relieved of the necessity of thinking about himself, not out of virtue, out of a creditable will to moderation and simplicity, but because their supreme master so demands. It is his dominating instinct, at least during periods when they are pregnant with something great." End quote. What Nietzsche discovers here is the birth of asceticism from the requirements of self-birth. Asceticism, in the fundamental sense, does not reject the will. It is, on the contrary, an expression of a strong pooling of will, an energetic summary of all partial drives in a single ray of will. Nietzsche's discourse on the will to power is also latently at the service of this thought, and remains incomprehensible without this discovery. In it, the idea of the possibility of a univocal existence of language inches forward. It is the idea of the possibility of a monothematic will. Only the monothematics of the will steers the will towards itself, and thus onto the self-bearing track. All that an ultimately pulled together will to oneself can possibly want is, eo ipso, self-making, self-reliance, self-birth, self-realization. To the extent the asceticism is an exercise of the will to abstain from parasitic auxiliary drives and stray impulses, it serves the self-bearing erection of the subject. Through it, it becomes its own content, because only those who know to abstain can contain themselves, find themselves to be enough, keep themselves upright, and become those who stand, hold, carry, set up, give, and found from their own efforts. In this program of a self-upright holding stance, it is impossible not to hear the masculinist tenor. The suspicion arises that the subject of the philosophers is perhaps nothing more than a logically encoded fantasy about the possibility of permanent erection from cradle to grave. In the self-born formation of the subject, the dynamics of masculinity as an urge to one's own standing are actually at work. Masculinity in the narrowest sense of the word exists only in connection with the history-making illusion of the independent erection. The philosophical code word for this is subject autonomy. Since the days of Plato, the phenomena of vocation to self-birth, male high feeling, and existential self-intensification in thought have been intimately interwoven, an impetus of eros into the vertical pulses through all of them. Can it be a coincidence that in Socrates the metaphysics got underway as maieutic, that is, as an obstetrics for a subjectivity that has to fight its way out of the womb grave of the body in order to keep itself upright in the heights of ideas? This peculiarly masculine obstetrics has created a historical precedent. What has been promoted to the light of the world by the art of philosophical midwifery in Greek antiquity has consequently continued to develop the metaphysics of work and technology as a mechanical uterus of human self-fabrication over the course of more than 2,000 years. The maieutic of the subject, metaphysics and technology, are each only aspects of the same phenomenon, which with its grandeur, as with its riskiness, has the historical world holding its breath. Aspects of the self-birth of the man-human. This takes place as a conquest of the vertical, as a revolution of self-born sovereignty against the humiliation of the old way of birthing, thus as a repulsion against old nature, and as the establishment of a phallic will of its own way, the establishment of a phallic will of its own against the dictatorship of mothers. Through a colossal tearing away of oneself, the andrological subject has begun to be self-interested and is mobilized as the commissioner of its own worlds. But it is precisely through its mobilization that it is finally confronted with the questions of how, after all, it intends to deal with nature as its origin, and whether it really believes it will escape its first birth via its second. Alright, that's the first half of the chapter. I'll do the next half of the chapter in the next video.